Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this midweek edition, the Midweek Wire here at 21 Wire Live. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on multiple platforms on X, Facebook Live, Rumble, YouTube, BitChute, and also on a few other platforms that we're trying out on the audio streams. Thank you for joining us, back by popular demand. Now, this is a program and a conversation that we planned to have just last week, but because of breaking news, we had to pivot. So I had Freddie Ponton on to discuss the total debacle that was unfolding in Washington, the Middle East, and everywhere else. And so we're going to continue this conversation, which I think is a really, really key conversation. We're going to go over some historical ground today during this discussion. And I'm joined by two excellent guests. They're going to help us to kind of put this whole thing into perspective. We're going to be talking about two pivotal events from the early 1980s and their implications going forward, absolutely connected to 2025, especially connected to the NordStream pipeline and the new Cold War between East and West, the Ukraine war, everything else. So these are the Yamal pipeline explosion in the early 1980s and an incident called Whiskey on the Rocks, which took place within the Swedish archipelago, just off the Baltic Sea. And this was a submarine incident involving a Soviet sub, and it kicked off a kind of an incident very similar, I would say, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only difference was Sweden was not a NATO member at the time. We'll get into this. How does this all connect to today? You'll be absolutely fascinated and shocked to know that it absolutely does. And to help us navigate this, we're going to bring on to the stage two guests right now. First is Freddie Ponton. He joined us last week. He's a special contributor at 21st Century Wire. Freddie, thank you for joining us again this week.
Well, it's a pleasure, Patrick. Thank you very much. And it's good to be back on the show and in great company with Mats and Nilsson. So I'm delighted. I look forward to this conversation.
And also from Sweden, he is a historian, also a fantastic global affairs and geopolitical analyst, Mats Nilsson, joining us on the live link now. Mats, thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure, Patrick.
So guys, as I said before, it's kind of an interesting conversation we're going to try to unpack here, and it's absolutely relevant to where we are today in the world. And let me just outline this here. What we're talking about when we're talking about the Yamal pipeline, and this is an incident that happened, I believe, in 1982 in Siberia. This was a pipeline that was delivering gas to Europe from the Soviet Union at the time. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because it's very similar to the NordStream sabotage incident. And what happened here, how this unfolded, was incredibly interesting. We'll talk about it with both Mats and Freddie. And there's a few good books on this. I'll just straight away point to people to some references. Here's one here called At the Abyss, an Insider's History of the Cold War. This is by Thomas C. Reed, former Secretary of the Air Force. And he's got a lot of the details of this within this book here. You can collect this on, I believe, Amazon. Some of the other booksellers is available. There's other work written about this. It's so important that we unpack this because it's absolutely connected to that, which is the NordStream sabotage. And we'll get into how this all fits together with our guests now. And first I want to kick off with Freddie. Freddie, I know you've looked at this incident in detail. Fred, I'm just blown away by the parallels between the sabotage of the Yamal pipeline. We'll share some of the details of how this was done. This was a U.S. espionage or a CIA-led operation to basically, at the time, it was a huge environmental disaster. They basically exploded the major Russian gas pipeline supplying gas into Europe. Very similar conditions politically, geopolitically, to that of the Nord Stream pipeline. Sanctions were placed on European countries by the U.S. initially for doing business with the Soviets, but Europe needed good, reliable, cheap gas, and they didn't, in the end, didn't get it, exactly as it's happened in the last couple of years. So it was a whole repeat here. That's what I find fascinating about this, Fred. Just if you can share your thoughts, and then we'll hear from Matt's on this as well. Go ahead, Freddie.
Yeah, of course, Pastor. There's a sense of déjà vu for sure with the Yamal pipeline. It's nothing short than a sabotage. I think what's really interesting is the state of mind and the context, the geopolitical context at the time. During the Cold War, and understanding at the end of the Cold War, understanding that from a French point of view, François Mitterrand took the liberty to share some information with Ronald Reagan at the time with regards to an asset which had been developed by the DST, basically the equivalent of the CIA in the United States. And they've turned a lieutenant colonel from the KGB, Vladimir Torshov. I think he's AKA Farewell, or Agent Farewell, working for the KGB. And he was an interesting guy because he'd worked for a very long time, and his job was to, I wouldn't say steal, but to acquire technology in the West, including in Europe and in the United States. And he had thousands of agents working for him spread across the world. And Mitterrand and Ronald got close and talking about how they could basically diminish the influence of the Russian vis-a-vis their export of gas into Europe. And the idea, and they knew that this gentleman, Farewell, knew exactly basically what the Russian wanted, what kind of technology they wanted. And one of the technology that was identified at the time was a technology that has to do with the flow of gas at the terminal of pipeline of the Yamal, basically terminal in Siberia in 1982. So the Russians were looking for this technology, and they were looking for it aggressively. So this information was basically passed on to the CIA, which at the time was run by Bill. What's his name? Just got out of my mind.
I think it's William.
Bill Casey.
Bill Casey
was a very close advisor, and of course CIA directors for the Ronald Reagan administration. They were very close. They were friends, basically. And this Farewell agent, Russian agent from the KGB, basically give out a lot of names of these agents, especially those in the United States and in Canada. And he also mentioned them that this technology and a software that a Canadian company had was of great interest for the Russians, especially for the gas sector, as it regulates the flow of gas in the pipeline. And that's how the whole story started, with this French asset that had been turned and kind of had a lot of quarrel with the radical USSR party, and definitely wanted to move away from them, and was prepared basically to give all his secrets. And what happened is Bill Casey at the CIA decided to arrest some of these assets, but they didn't arrest everyone. He wanted actually to use this opportunity to let the Russian acquire the software illegally, and planting basically Trojan horse in this software, which will eventually turn into the explosions of the pipeline by increasing the flow drastically, the flow of gas into the pipeline, leading to an explosion known today as the Yamal sabotage. So that's a very interesting context, because we can clearly see that during this era already there was an interest in attacking Russia, in undermining Russia economically and militarily speaking. So that falls into this context, and it's a very interesting reading if there's ever one.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting about this double agent that was set up, and very clever how the Americans drew him in, and there was lists of demands going back and forth, trading going back and forth. But what it reminded me of was this whole thing about this software that they needed to regulate the pressure of the gas.
Yeah.
And they basically inserted a Trojan horse in there. So they provided the product to the Soviet Union, and everything was running fine for a while. And then that Trojan horse kicked into gear, I think, after months or a year or something like that. And then all of a sudden you had this massive explosion, which could be seen by space, from space at the time. This was the largest non-nuclear, 3 kilotons, I think. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion on the planet in history up to that point. So that was huge. The thing that was crazy about this, Fred, is that it reminds me of the, we'll get to NordStream in a minute, but it reminds me of the Stuxnet attack. And this, again, a Trojan horse attack by the U.S. and the Iranian nuclear facilities here. This is just a diagram from Kaspersky Labs here, just explaining, how this was inserted in 2009 and sort of went active in 2010. So it's kind of dormant almost for like 11 months, 12 months, and then Stuxnet kicks into action. And so there's, again, similar methods, similar tradecraft with these two operations. That's one of the things I found interesting, Fred, was the parallel between Stuxnet and the Yamal sabotage. But
it's the same. They run basically a cycle, millions of cycle, until such a time with a timer, which is very interesting because it opens the debate of understanding targeting doctrines, whether you're into NATO, whether you're into the US military. There's targeting doctrines, and these doctrines I develop according to the target, where the geographical location of the target, but also the intended the intentions behind taking out this particular target. So in this particular case, as well as for the NordStream sabotage, we're talking about a deliberate target. If you read carefully the NATO doctrines, they talk about targeting, strategy, and deliberate target, which has a timer attached to it. And the notion of time is very important because it's a turnkey solutions. When it's in, it's going to be delivered, and you get to decide how long and when this is going to go off. In this particular case, the Trojan horse in this particular software delivered a certain amount of millions of cycle until such a time it was activated.
Yeah. And also there's a timing aspect to the NordStream sabotage, many people believe as well. So we'll get to that in a moment. But Mats, this Yamal pipeline, to me, like the parallels to the current day are just like unbelievable. It's almost like chapter and verse. The argument from the United States was the same, was that Europe was going to become dependent on Soviet or Russian gas at the time. And that was a talking point we learned later that was generated within the CIA's information warfare, information operations. So they kind of planted that talking point into European media. And the United States then riffed off that, the Reagan administration at the time. And so that was it's exactly the same talking point that they've used to justify Nord Stream, even though they're not admitting responsibility for Nord Stream, but to justify sanctions, to justify Nord Stream. There were sanctions put on in 1981 before the explosion in 82. Same type of thing. I think France was the country, we'll talk to Freddie about that, but France basically broke the secondary sanctions, and they tried to put sanctions on technology. Even people who had relicensed U.S. technology, like General Electric's, turbines for the gas pressure, they were saying anything that had U.S. technology in it fell under sanctions. I mean, it was a full spectrum kind of sanctions regime, and all the gas passed through West Germany. So that was a deal between Bonn and Moscow at the time. And so so many similarities, Mats, to what we've seen recently. Your thoughts on Yamal and why it's still relevant?
Well, for me, it's more of a, if I put myself into the situation of the Americans, or if I were an American planning shenanigans, I would say, why break a winning concept? Reagan was on record saying that this was part of economic warfare against the Soviet bloc, and that he wasn't even trying to hide it. It was one of his tools in the toolbox that America used and is obviously still using. And as we will discuss later when it comes to Whiskey on the Rocks, this usage of information gained from within the Soviet Union also has some striking similarities, because one of the theories put forward now is that the reason that the Soviet submarine struck aground in the place where it did, we will come to that later, is down to the fact that the Americans, or perhaps the British, or a combination of both, were able to infiltrate the Russian or the Soviet Navy, thereby getting to the most senior officer on board, who wasn't supposed to be on board, but still was in charge of navigation. So there is reason to believe that somehow he was paid off to create this havoc that the Western powers knew was going to be created once the submarine hit the Swedish territorial waters. And in a combination of economic warfare, getting assets to turn against the Soviet Union, as it were, is a strategy that has been used then and is still in usage now. However, I think one can argue that since especially the CIA have kind of lost their human resources management, they are not quite as good as they used to be in gaining direct contact to Russian assets. Thereby, they are struggling right now to get people close enough to do this damage within Russia. But they have done so before, and I think there's a red line between Yamal through the U-137 submarine and to NordStream and onwards, which one always must have at the front of their heads while discussing these issues.
Yes, in regards to Yamal, and thank you for that perspective, Mats, and it'll be very interesting when we move the conversation on to whiskey on the rocks. And with regard to Yamal, the parallels, I'll just go over this again because they're absolutely striking, and I'll get Freddie's comment on this. First of all, the exact talking point: European countries becoming overly dependent on Russian gas. That was one of them. The other is the U.S. offered, Reagan said, no, we'll provide you with coal. We'll provide you with coal, very much like LNG being shipped over the Atlantic. And that was a non-starter for Europe because they needed coal conversion plants and things like that. But they said, oh, no, we'll send you coal. And then we have the other one that's a parallel was Reagan temporarily lifted the embargo. Okay. And Biden did the same thing in the interim with Nord Stream. And that created a sense of, it released the pressure a little bit. But while that was happening, the covert operation was being mounted behind the scenes. So it was a kind of a diplomatic bait and switch by the U.S. government. They did that tactic twice. They did it with Yamal, and they kind of did it the same with Nord Stream. And then the public would say, oh, Biden's giving concessions to the Russians, Biden's weak. But in the meantime, the Nord Stream sabotage was being planned and executed at that time during the interim period. So that was interesting. The other one was the fact that obviously Germany being the fulcrum of the both operations in terms of the transit hub, and the CIA assessment and the pipeline damage and what that did to the Soviet economy as well. But it was the thing they were most concerned about which was interesting, was they sold this within the intelligence community of preventing Soviet influence in European affairs. But what they really wanted to do was there was a level of interdependency. So if the Europeans were basically they had a pipe for gas deal where the Europeans were providing steel pipes and the Russians were paying them with gas. That's how they got the project up and running. And then the Europeans were giving them technology, so the Russians didn't have to develop their own technology. So that kind of interdependence, it kind of created a kind of security guarantee between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. And it created potential for friendship and stability. That's what the U.S. wanted to intervene and disrupt, was the potential for friendship, stability. And what happened in the end, Russia ended up being self-sufficient anyway. They ended up developing their whole end-to-end gas industry. And so it was going to happen anyway. The United States was trying to disrupt it in the 80s, and it didn't work. And here we go again, Freddie. It's like history repeating itself once again. Your thoughts on the incredible parallels here?
Well, the only difference is of course the Yamal and the 10 years, that preceded the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. I think it's important to remember this context. And there is different approach to the problem, the Russian or the USSR problem for the United States. From an economic point of view, they tried different things. And the first thing they did was to get closer with Saudis in terms of oil, to trying to get the Saudi to lower the price of the barrel, because that was good business for the United States. And on the other hand, this will obviously impact the USSR, the Soviet Union economy. And at the time, 50% of the budget of the economy was allocated to defense matters, to military issues. And so it was important for them to cripple, the economy one way or the others. And I think, as I said again, many people thought that the big secret of the United States at the time, the USSR, sorry, the big secret of the USSR at the time was the submarine, the missiles, all this kind of really, new technology and extremely, highly skilled technology. But the biggest secret of the USSR is that they were broke and that the economy was falling apart. And that is really where we can see the Ronald Reagan administrations moving forward, moving from a defense position to an attack, to a much more aggressive, to a much more, showing and projecting strength in different aspects of the world, including the northern flank and Sweden and the Baltic Sea and so on, and the Barents Sea as well, up in the north with Norway. So very important to understand that the economics were approached in different ways with the Saudis, but also with projecting this superiority in terms of computing, in terms of microchips and so on. And there's of course, story about how technology was getting into the Soviet Union via East Germany. And you can read about Robert Maxwell and all these guys. They were all involved in that. But inside this technology, there was a lot of course, intelligence, and the idea was to monitor, was to listen, and sometimes to sabotage. And some of this technology were very advanced, used into for the Air Force and used for air operations and so on. So it's really, really interesting how technology, the revolution of technology and microchips, we can draw the parallel with the revolution of artificial intelligence today. It's the similar, but it's such a different era. So it's difficult to compare.
Yes. And just going back to, I'll put on the book again, At the Abyss, an Insider's History of the Cold War, talking about a lot of the things Freddie was just mentioning there, technology of the day. There are a lot of parallels. There was a race then, there is a race now on different levels. The other thing that was interesting about the Yamal, and we'll get on to Whiskey on the Rocks in a moment, but the other thing is the United States was also worried that if Soviet Union were supplying too much gas or oil to Europe, that it would reduce their dependency on OPEC countries. And at the time, OPEC was very much under the control of the United States, or very much under the influence of the United States. But there was something else that could have potentially come from that as well, is that there was the potential of doing all of that energy trade potentially outside of the dollar. And this was also a threat that I think the United States was hedging against at the time, even though that's not it wasn't as big of a talking point then, because that was in the sort of a decade after, the end of Bretton Woods, moving on to the petrodollar. But so, in terms of that, not just the energy mats, but also the fact that it's outside of the United States' full spectrum dominion, basically. Your thoughts?
Because this is an area that, being a legal historian, this is something that goes back to one of those wonderful theories from the 19th century in regards to basically for America, in order to maintain its petrodollar, being, as they used to say, being a sea power, America has always had the view that they have to have roadblocks in place. And by roadblocks, I mean they have to have continuous conflicts across the Eurasian continent, be they in Afghanistan, be they in Ukraine, be they in the Middle East, or be they between India and China. It's in order to halt an economic development among a very formidable Euro-Asian bloc, should this bloc be allowed to prosper. So there is always an emphasis from the British and the American empires being seaborne to prevent a surplus economic area integration in Eurasia. So these conflicts that have been brewing, Yamal is just one example. Then you have more tangible conflict like the one Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, now Ukraine, are all roadblocks strategically created to stop this integration. And of course, the NordStream sabotage was also done with this theory in mind. So external meddling, particularly from the Anglo-Saxons, it's always a key factor when looking at these conflicts. So the Sea Island powers of the US and the United Kingdom always seek to maintain fiscal control by keeping maritime choke points. But should the Eurasian economic power develop, those choke points will lose value if the pipelines and if the internal transportation systems across the Eurasian continents will be put in place. There is trouble ahead. So China's Belt and Road Initiative is a clear and present danger to the American and the UK power. If India, if the Middle East, if China, if Russia, and if the European Union should suddenly decide that we've had enough, we're going to start cooperating in a more permanent way, the fundamentals of the US empire would disintegrate in a very short amount of time. And this is what America is constantly working against. Divide and conquer the Eurasian area by putting up these roadblocks. The heartland must never be united. And I still think this theory has some merit to it, even though it's over 100 years old.
Well, the power of the sea. I think it was Admiral, the U.S. Maritime historian Admiral Thayer Mahan, I believe his name was. But the power of the sea versus the Mackinder World Island conceptualization of the Eurasian continent. But the British were the first to imagine the world as a unit, basically, the whole planet as kind of one unit, and the world island, the Eurasian continent, joined together, Europe and Asia being that kind of key world island, and then the heartland within the world island. So it's a very interesting concept. But thanks to Freddie for finding this fantastic piece that we have on 21st Century Wire. And one of the things in here, Freddie, was that when you look into the actual intelligence declassified documents around Yamal, and you look at the actual words and admissions at the time, they saw this as a threat to NATO. So even then the US admits after the fact that gas coming from Russia to Europe was a threat to NATO's quote mission. So that makes us ask this question, Freddie, what is NATO's mission? I thought it was a defensive alliance. Why would NATO be worried about gas, cheap, affordable gas coming into Europe? And what happened after this? Europe basically went into an economic stagnation into part of the 1980s. Could the economy might have been totally different had that relationship with the East developed, but the United States was there to shut that door pretty hard at the time. Go ahead, Freddie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the geopolitics, even if they're separated with 100 years, it doesn't matter. They still apply to some degrees. If you want to undermine an economy, if you want to undermine a peer adversary, and especially weaken his economy, you're going to try to do different things, amongst which pinning them in a war of attrition. If you look at Afghanistan, it becomes the Vietnam War for the Soviet Union, if you will. And it's exactly the same we're seeing in Ukraine. Pin them down into a war that's going to cost them a lot of money, and then attacks the key infrastructures, key economic, those that could provide a tremendous amount of revenue to support the war effort, or simply the developments or the economic development of these countries. And it's really about that. It's about really keeping Russia as weak as possible and not allowing this rapprochement between the Soviet Union at the time and Germany, and Russia today with Germany. And you would think that the fall of the Berlin Wall would have changed something, and NATO would have basically been out of purpose, if you will, and then sent back to where they come from. But they prepared this ground, and we can clearly see how the events from 1980, 81, 82, 83, and so on, all the way to 1989, shaped the world. It really shaped the world that we are living in today, the geopolitics of today, as well as, of course, our understanding of what NATO was to become. That's what NATO never left. Often people say, but what NATO stayed after the fall of the Berlin Wall? They stayed because the target was always to maintain this block, this hurdle between the Russians and Germany, and more importantly, to always keep a door open to control Eurasia, if you will, going back to Nicholas Spykman, as you said, and Alfred McInders, and so on. So very interesting to look at that. Even the perspective sometimes a little bit different, but the end game is the same, and that is to weaken a huge nation that has a huge history, that has always had a connections with Europe, and that is absolutely unfathomable for the United States. This has been a long game for a very long time. And I think the Ronald Reagan era is very telling, because we can clearly see how this rogue organization, these secret committees are coming together to form basically alongside with the UK. This has never been done alone. If you look at the NordStream sabotage, you're going to ultimately have to look at this relationship and understand the NATO construct and who runs maritime operation. This is still Northwood UK Markham maritime, commands of NATO. So when you understand this construct, you understand that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is an American general. Then you understand that this is not going to happen. Nothing's going to happen in the NATO lake, because that's how they call it. The Baltic Sea is a NATO lake, and nothing is going to happen in this particular part of the world without the Brits and the American knowing what's going on. And that's a very important, and we'll see by talking about, what we're going to discuss today is how that all fits in.
Matt, you want to weigh in on that?
No, I can only say that this is the red line going back many decades from America. And I think now, when Trump is in power, and it's always difficult to make any predictions when it comes to Trump, but since he's a money man, he's looking for deals, meaning that Trump is probably looking at this from an economic perspective, and the world economy is constantly still growing, but the key areas that are still underdeveloped, but where there is slow and steady economic progress, is within the Eurasian landmass. And once the supply chains are getting more and more interconnected, there will be a whole lot of profit to be made. So I mean, the EU has an educated workforce. Russia has natural resources. China has a large workforce, a great many factories. India is a rising economy, and all the Gulf states are energy exporters, net energy exporters. So right now, I mean, America still holds control or cooperation with the United Kingdom and with Japan, but both these areas are dying, so to speak, economically, politically, militarily, and there's a diminishing influence. So thereby, there might actually be a insight on Trump's behalf that he perhaps needs to find a new strategy. If he will be allowed to do that, or if there is some other great plan, I don't know. But there is an economic incentive for Trump to start looking into perhaps negotiating with these different power structures within the developing area of the Eurasian continent. I don't know. It's just me guessing, basically, but making an educated guess at least.
Well, it's like I can't imagine someone like you advising President Trump, Mats. Probably be an earful for Donald. I don't know if he'll be able to go that deep, but
Well, if I say profit, if I start with the word profit,
yeah,
you might actually be able to keep his attention for at least a 20-second sales pitch.
yep. Yeah, that elevator pitch, that's all you need, about 30 seconds
Yeah.
with Donald. So all this kind of like the Yamal, and I'll ask Freddie this question, but when I think about the Yamal pipeline, and then I'm thinking about NordStream, and that question always comes into my mind, Freddie, which is that received wisdom says that the Nord Stream sabotage was a reaction to Russia, quote, invading Ukraine. But I kind of began looking at this in reverse, that the war in Ukraine was a reaction in terms of NATO doing everything to draw Russia in, everything. This was a reaction to the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline. So that chicken and the egg debate, I look at it in the reverse of what the kind of regular received wisdom is, mainstream wisdom is on this, Freddie. I don't know if you agree or not, but I think that's kind of an important fundamental question, isn't it? Which one caused which? What do you think?
I'm sure James Angleton, the head of counterintelligence at the CIA, would have loved these questions, because this is all about a psychological operation. This is nothing else. This is really about selling you an idea of something that is simply not real. And that's what we are seeing, and that's the typical signs you see of empire declining. When they decline, they're starting to rely tremendously on subversion, on psychological warfare, and trying to keep control, because simply they cannot afford militarily or economically speaking to sustain this large presence around the world. USSR was the same. It was just too big for them. It was just a too big a nut to crack. And at a certain time, when you arrive at this stage, you're going to use other means to convince people that you're still the right partners. You're the right person, and you're in power and you're in control. What we're seeing in the United States at the moment is exactly that. And that when you look into the Nord Stream, this is about control. This is about printing in people's minds in Europe that Russia is still a threat and is still there, and it needs to be combated. And that's what you hear from the European Union 24/7. It's a threat, and we are fighting a threat. So Ukraine being a battleground where this threat has been addressed does not explain the Nord Stream sabotage, which is not a military target at all. It cannot be defined as a military target on the basis that is not basically providing revenues for the Russian states, the Russian Federation states. It's not making any money out of Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1. Everything was obviously brought to a stop, to a halt with various sanctions, especially with Germany putting sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline days before the special operation, military operation from Russia. So this is not an economic, this is not a military issue. This has nothing to do with the invasions or what you call the special military operation in Ukraine. This has to do with something much more profound. It's a very strong message. And this is, again, look at the geographical place where this is happening. This is halfway down between Russia and Germany. And this is happening in an area that is the NATO lake, really completely controlled by NATO or primarily controlled by NATO, especially in this particular area in the Danish and the Swedish EEZ. So there is a psychological kind of connotation to the Nord Stream sabotage as well. It has much more than just an economic sanctions or a physical sanction to the export of Russian gas into Europe.
I just thought this is a really important event to go over, because the parallels are just uncanny. And so what it shows us is that, and Mats, you kind of alluded to this at the beginning, this familiar pattern, familiar formula for success, it's repeated again. So that makes me obviously want to point the finger at the United States and the CIA as the sort of brainchild of them, the Nord Stream sabotage, just based on past behavior, identical talking points, identical political dynamics, identical pressure and political leverage that's being applied. I mean, it's like too much. I mean, one thing's the same. Then when you get down to number 7, 8, 9, 10, at some point, you just got to say it's very likely that this is coming out of Washington. But we'll put that circumstantial analysis off to the side and add it to our file for later. And it's a growing file. Let's just say. Now let's shift to this incident called Whiskey on the Rocks. And thanks to Freddie had sent me this trailer that Disney got a hold of this story. Matt, I don't know if you've seen the thriller, the new thriller called Whiskey on the Rocks. So this is the Disney version of history. I'm going to play this trailer for you guys, which I find to be highly entertaining. And then we'll talk about this incident as well as bring up the sort of historical receipts on this as well. But here's the trailer. This is history according to the Disney Channel. But here we go.
А что, мы в Клипете, что ли?
En 80 meter lång sovjetisk ubåt ligger 50 meter från land, mitt i svenskt militärt skyddsområde. Vad kallar du det här för? En picknick?
What's going on, General? The Russians have launched a potential attack against Sweden.
Значит, операция провалилась.
Get me the Swedish Prime Minister on the phone. Jag vill inte dö. Ska vi inte bara... Vi sticker upp händerna i luften och så ger vi upp.
Vi har 5 sovjetiska örlogsfartyg på väg emot oss. Vi kan i nuläget inte utesluta ett fritagningsförsök. Lägg där till ett okänt antal ubåtar under vatten. NATO i luften över oss.
The world has never been closer to a third world war than now.
Ja, jag har missat något.
Nej.
Goddamn Swedes.
Mats, I didn't know that it never seen anything make Sweden look that sexy and exciting as that trailer there. I mean, so they've got the drunken Russians, all the stereotypes are in there, the American cowboys, the Swedes sitting there fishing, watching the clouds go by. I mean, so what I don't know if you're familiar with this depiction of Whiskey on the Rocks, man.
It's actually a Swedish TV production. So it ran in Sweden during this winter season. And just first off, a quick anecdote is that there was actually some critique against this show in Sweden, and it might not be the critique that you would expect to hear, but it was the critique was you're portraying the Soviets as being too warm-hearted and nice, meaning that they were portrayed as quite lovable drunks. So there was actually a critique saying that this is not the way we should portray the Soviets or the Russians. You know, we really need to tell people that they're evil. And I'm not even going to get into that discussion, but that kind of, you know, puts Sweden where it is concerning the propaganda part of how much we're taught to hate the Russians in this country. So a comedy is actually critiqued for portraying drunken Russians as being too lovable. So it was a good. I mean, it was an entertaining show. I can say that much. As based on true events, yes, it was based on true events, and let's just leave it at that. The facts are a whole lot different.
I don't know, Freddie. What did you think? What did you think of this? I know you probably haven't seen the whole program, or not, but you know, this kind of. What my concern, Freddie, when I see these productions made is what are they trying to gloss over? Basically, that's what I'm thinking of when I see productions like this one? What are they trying to basically gloss over? What are they highlighting? What are they trying to get you to pay attention to? And then what are they basically trying to steer you away from? So this is, I think, there's a lot to steer away from here, Freddie. Actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, Disney for me is for kids. It's entertainment. It's about, providing a very light story that's going to make families spend a good time in front of a screen together for an hour and a half or whatever. And that's very innocent on the surface. And then, of course, if you try to be a little bit more serious about analyzing the entire Disney, Hollywood, and, the entire movie industry itself and the entertainment industry, then things are getting slightly a little bit darker. And then, of course, you're going to see very quickly that the intelligence world and the intelligence community mingle with this kind of I'm not saying these particular productions, but it's known that Hollywood has been very much directed by the CIA, and a lot of things that comes out of these productions have message embedded in there. So it's part of the, as I say, the James Angleton way, if you will, of really shaping the narrative. That's why it's important to describe. And we're going to see that, when we talk about Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, someone being depicted as a communist, as a KGB asset, someone that works basically for the Soviet Unions, and that's really part of the game, and this has been going on for a very long time, unfortunately. So that looks pretty light to me, and as Matt says, it's based on real events. What matters and what probably people would be more interested in is the real fact. What actually was happening at that time? Who was behind the scene? What do we need to know?
Yeah, the other thing is the timing of this, Matt. These types of productions are coming up. They're being made at a time when Sweden has clearly been strong-armed into joining NATO on the back of hysteria over the Ukraine conflict. And then you have these very strategic redepictions, really casting it in the kind of anti-Russian or, the West versus Russian, that there was this major, potential war that broke out. I mean, it was serious at the time, Whiskey on the Rocks, and we'll look at this as a historic event. You can go to the site here in the archipelago here, and you can see this is from one of, I think, the Swedish tourist or it's sort of geography website here, and there's the plaque, the official plaque there at this tiny Swedish island, which commemorates the Cold War stand-up with the Soviet submarine intrigue and so forth there. But they're kind of like trying to, I think, in a way, condition the public, Mats, to look at these events in a different sort of way. Maybe in a more confrontational way, and it just kind of puts Sweden from a neutral country, because if you look at Whiskey on the Rocks as an incident, how it was diffused is quite an amazing story, and I don't think it would have been the fact that Sweden was neutral meant that they could just they kind of did it very kind of almost smoothly how they unwound this thing after that tension built up. But because Sweden wasn't a NATO country, it gave it a lot more latitude in terms of diplomacy, negotiations. What's your recollection of this event, Matt?
First of all, just to take you back to that time, you have to remember that, which is people quite quickly forget, that at the time, if you just had headed south, you would strike a Warsaw Pact country, because the East German border ran all the way up to Lübeck of today. So both Poland and East Germany, and then you had the USSR all along the other side of the Baltic coast. So Sweden was definitely embedded between the two adversaries. That said, you have to remember that intelligence cooperation was so deep and developed, particularly in regards to signal intelligence, that in practice Sweden was treated as if a NATO member already back from 1952. And Olof Palme, shortly before his death, even mentioned the fact that he had worked with analysts within the armed forces intelligence services in Sweden at the beginning of 1950s as part of the then prime minister's so-called general staff. So Palme once told the future supreme commander in Sweden, General Synnergren, that while his rhetoric was important for the domestic policy reasons, the armed forces of Sweden should continue to ensure a good relationship with the United States. So Palme was a very complex figure, which of course still raises questions about who and why and he was killed. But that's another episode of 21st Wire. But I think few have viewed the Soviet submarine as anything other than the submarine being on a deliberate spy mission that ended as it did due to a so-called navigational error, or perhaps due to drunkenness on board. But there are so many things that are speaking against this, and state investigations have actually tried to steer clear. Later state investigations in Sweden have tried to steer clear of actually saying what the reason was. Because if it was a mission to either pick up some Russian Soviet spies, or if it was a mission to go in and try and gain some intelligence, it was just plain, it was just beyond stupid. No one, not even a drunken Soviet admiral, would come up with this plan, thereby saying that to determine the reason for the intrusion as being a part of an extremely serious misnavigation is quite obviously not going to fly if you put it under a serious investigation, as now has been done. And that's where the new theory comes in about why it happened and how it could have happened.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the new theory, talking about the compromising high-ranking member of the crew of this Soviet submarine that ended up getting stranded on the rocks here. Well, just to reiterate, this is in the Swedish archipelago, and this happened, I believe, in 1981. And so we had this submarine stuck here. It created a kind of high alert in the area, and really a kind of east-west military standoff. It escalated quite quickly. I believe the Swedish prime minister at the time, Torbjörn Taldin, more of a hardliner, I would say, in comparison to Olof Palme. But the accusation was that there were nukes on board, and they say they detected or suspected uranium 238 and so forth. This was never confirmed by the Russians, but how it got the term whiskey on the rocks was this was a whiskey class submarine. The crew of 56 people, a W class, whiskey class submarine, diesel electric submarine, a U-137. I believe it was about 249 feet in length. And so it's very typical of the fleet that the Soviet Union had at the time. But the context of this is interesting, Mats, because of the nuclear accusations. What was going on? This is where it gets interesting. What was actually going on at the time in Europe? Major arms limitations, negotiations. The U.S. was very adamant about putting nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, Pershing 2 missiles on European soil. That sparked a huge outcry from the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the Green parties and so forth throughout Europe. That was the sort of context of what was going on. So while this whiskey on the rocks incredible story was unfolding in Sweden, and this also gets to the heart of where Swedish politics was at the time. And you mentioned the former Swedish PM who came in a bit later and who was, I believe, assassinated in 1986, Olof Palme, who was a socialist by all accounts. And this is a really interesting story because of what was going on at the time, Matt. And I'll go to Freddie first on this. But the context of it, Sweden wasn't a NATO member, but you have the Swedish prime minister at the time, huge advocate, peace advocate, disarmament advocate, definitely a champion of what we would call the global South today, who was gunned down in cold blood in just a few years later. But so the context of this and the whole idea of nuclear, the Soviets being a nuclear threat, really probably a lot of pressure was placed on Sweden at the time, how they dealt with this. Sweden just being very, very critical strategically for NATO, even though they weren't a member at the time. But now they are. Now they are. So I think the Hawks got their wish eventually, Freddie, years and years later. Just your thoughts on the kind of context of what was going on at the time of Whiskey on the Rocks in the 1980s, Freddie.
Well, there's definitely a geographical context, as Mats has just said. You know, Sweden is just across the pond from USSR, so we understand from documents and from various interviews that has been conducted over the years that the Ronald Reagan administration was extremely worried about the Olaf Palme, as you mentioned, is social democrats, and Sweden at the time was the powerhouse in the world for social democrats, and very much supported by the German social democrat movement with people like Bill Grant or Egon Bahr, for example, you know, from the SDF. So these are all basically a very worrisome signal that the United States had to appreciate at its core values, simply because NATO was involved, because the stance of the United States was not about finding peace with the Soviet Union, nor agreeing to any demilitarizations, disarmament, if you will. And the rhetoric that was coming out of the Olaf Palme administration was very much about a politic of rapprochement, a politic of détente. And the belief was that if you can get closer to the USSR without actually posing a threat to them, but trying to engage in dialogue and cooperation, trade, and so on, that there was a way forward to find a common ground and common agreement. So it was about peace. It was about creating a free demilitarized zone in Europe. It was about moving away the nuclear threat, which could only trigger and brought basically an alliation on both sides of the bloc, whether it's US or whether it was the Russian bloc. So Olaf Palme was a very interesting character for that particular reason, because he advocated peace and demilitarization. And then on the other side, this is someone that was, I think, probably more on the personal level, very involved and very interesting in various movements around the world, advocating for freedom, independence, sovereignty, and the real kind of social democrats pillar movements, defending Palestine. You know, Olaf Palme went all the way down to meet with Yasser Arafat with the OLP. Sweden was sponsoring the ANC, for their fight against apartheid, with Nelson Mandela and so on. And then there's all the other region, that Sweden and Olaf Palme was visiting, like Angola, Mozambique, all the way down to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So a lot of involvements, a lot of ideology, and then, of course, nothing that will be a starter for the CIA or MI6. So the United States knew that they had to do something. This guy was a danger, and this is certainly not someone that was supporting the NATO expansion and the undermining or attacking the economy of Russia. So they had to put him in a situation where he had no other choice but to go along with the program. And that's exactly what the United States embarked on. It was a long journey, but it was probably the most successful psychological operation of the Cold War.
And Matt's put back on screen. Thank you for that, Freddie. This was from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article, just I believe just before the new year. The rise and fall of Sweden's nuclear disarmament advocacy, and of course you have Olaf Palme here with, at the time, I believe this was the Finnish prime minister. And it just is kind of an interesting, one of many interesting historical pieces here that just shows this kind of trajectory of Swedish politics and Swedish geopolitics, and this complete 180 of where Sweden was before and where they have been, I would say, dragged to now Certainly, I don't think it is not. I don't think this metamorphosis of Sweden's international politics is natural. Let's just say I don't think it's organic. I think it's genetically modified, if you want to take another term and inject it in there. But your thoughts about the context of Olof Palme at the time and the Cold War, and how you think this relates to the present day, Mats?
Well, what happened after Whiskey on the Rocks? Now, if it was an elaborate false flag operation with involving the possibility of a bribed commander or not, that can be discussed. But Olof Palme was tied. He couldn't really continue along this road of having discussions with the Soviet Union about creating a lake of peace, as he called it, Fredens hav, within the Baltic region. Because whenever he tried to do that internally, there would always be a new submarine encounter. A few years, I think 1 year or 2 years after Whiskey on the Rocks in 1983, in Sweden, we had something called Hårsfjärden, which was one of these situations where there were positive sightings of a U-boat or a submarine, and where depth charges were dropped in order to catch this submarine. Obviously, it was depicted as having to be a Soviet submarine. There have, of course, never been any proof of this, and even Bobby Ray Inman, who is still alive today, who was the acting deputy director of Central Intelligence, has gone on record and said that Soviet submarines never ventured into the Swedish archipelago. Yes, they did venture into Swedish territorial waters, but on the edge of the waters in order to get to know the area, but they never went in deeper into the Swedish archipelago areas due to the fact that they didn't feel that they had the capacity to do so. So this was done in order to, one, see to it that Sweden's military industry continued to make or to produce weapons. Obviously, I mean, the Wallenberg family is always involved in this in one way or another. You have to remember that the director of one of the Wallenberg's banks, Carle Arvid Norlin, was one of the people having discussions with the CIA director of Central Intelligence during the time. So it was also in order to facilitate the Swedish military-industrial complex, because the orders for the new Swedish attack fighter, the JAS Gripen, which is still being developed, was made after the Whiskey on the Rocks happened. So one, you tied Palme down. He wasn't able to complete his de-escalatory talks. And two, you kept the Swedish military-industrial complex going full speed ahead, because once again, you were able to waive the fear of the Russians or the Soviets in the face of the Swedish voter. So that means that the Swedish voters accepted a continued military escalation. So this was the effect. And then, of course, the subsequent submarine intrusions were probably made by German or British submarines, as have been explained by military admirals within the UK establishment in private discussions. So this was another very, very well executed false flag operation or PSYOP in order to keep the Swedish public in fear of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, even if we despise what they do, we still have to admit that they have been very good at their job in both Washington and London, unfortunately.
No, that's for sure. And what I found is interesting with regards to the assassination of Olof Palme and the timing of this as well. Netflix just did a kind of, rendition of this, which was, I believe it was released in 2021. So this is right, the timing of this is uncanny, right before the whole Ukraine farrago kicks off. And they find that, they had to basically do this. And this got basically panned by a lot of people who are critics who know a lot about this assassination. And they kind of pinned it on this kind of likely a Scandia man, I think his nickname was Stig Engstrom, who many people said there was no really definitive evidence, but this Netflix documentary kind of moved it in that direction, but is not conclusive. And there were other, suspects at the time that were kind of let go back in the 80s when they're sort of investigating this. So it's one of these kind of really messy kind of deep state assassination jobs with a really bad sort of post-media treatment to it. But it's almost like if they had really been doing their job properly and looking at the context of this crime and then looking at the geopolitical significance and then tying that to the present day geopolitics, that's what I would like to see from media, Mats, or I'd like to see more from Hollywood. But instead, no, you get the whitewash version.
Yes.
And that's what a lot of critics thought this was. Did you see this particular Netflix piece, and or what have you heard about it? What's your opinion on this, Mats?
Well, I can actually give an opinion on this. I have been treating the Olof Palme affair at a bit of a distance because I really haven't had the time to get into it. But right now, I am actually reading this book, which is a book about the Olof Palme murder, written by a man called Gunnar Wall. And he goes into the fact, he looks into the person who has Engström, who has been accredited in court as being the murderer. But what Gunnar has done, and being a lawyer myself, I can follow the forensics very well. He makes a very convincing argument that he was a scapegoat and that there actually were two separate hit teams working on either side of Sveavägen that evening in order to have a cooperation to kill Olof Palme. And he makes the connection to the so-called Stay Behind movement in Sweden, which was very heavily influenced by a lot of Navy officers within the Swedish military. So I haven't finished reading the book, but I have a few chapters left. But I think you can make the argument that the Palme case is far from solved, and like the JFK murder, it probably will be. If I will still be around when the solution comes, I don't know. But in 40 years' time, there will probably be documents leaked to prove that this was a greater conspiracy. Who made the conspiracy, who ordered it, that I can't say, or we can't say here in Sweden today. But that Stig Engström wasn't the killer is, I would say, beyond any reasonable doubt. And it's just embarrassing that he was put to have this label on him. Even after his death, he was given this label. So it was obviously a way to avoid having to go through the courts. So it's still alive. The discussion is alive. But once again, the mainstream media should have been all over this book. And the mainstream media has just met it with total silence. There is no discussion on it. There is no debate. The cultural, the pages that deal with this in the major news dailies here in Sweden, they haven't even written about this book. Even though Palme should have been one of their favorite politicians, being as these pages are quite often socialist in nature. But the socialists of today are a different version of the Swedish socialists that existed in the 1980s. So once again, the mainstream media is doing the bidding of the psyops from the Western world and just suppressing this knowledge, letting Netflix put out this false narrative about Stig Engström being the lone killer, which is
the classic.
It's bollocks.
The lone, to use a British term,
Yep.
the classic lone wolf, a crazed conspiracy theorist like the Mel Gibson character in the film Conspiracy, totally. And then the conspiracy crowd are talking about, MK Ultra, and then you get down that rabbit hole. When in fact you mentioned something, Freddie, I'll get your comment. What you were going to say previously, Freddie. Plus this, Matt's mentioned the Stay Behind operation. Of course, that brings us here to Operation Gladio, which was very active and thriving at the time, especially around these geopolitical events in Europe. I'm putting up Daniel Ganser's great book, NATO's Secret Armies, here. I used to have a copy that I paid a very dear price for on Amazon, about $220. And I made the catastrophic error of lending it to a friend of mine. And you know how that goes when you lend books to friends, everybody. But this is NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio, and Terrorism in Western Europe. This is a major academic work here, one of the foundational texts for Operation Gladio. It tells the story of NATO's secret anti-communist stay-behind armies that had been set up by the CIA and MI6 after World War II in all countries of Western Europe, and some countries became tragically linked to, quote, right-wing terrorism. And they also used left-wing groups that they penetrated as well to demonize left-leaning governments at the time. So that was Operation Gladio. But go ahead, Freddie, on what you were going to say previously, responding to Matt's, and then just your thoughts on the Gladio aspect of Olof Palme. Go ahead, Freddie. Go ahead, unmute your mic if you can. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. Yes, I mean, clearly, everybody's pretty much familiar with Gladio and the series of assassinations they've been credited for across Eastern Europe, Europe and Central Europe. But in general, what really matters for me, there's 2 points here that is really important to point out. First is the role of the media. There's no doubt with the entire propaganda narrative that was developed with the CIA, with James Angleton, the idea of portraying and promoting Olof Palme as a communist was the beginning of the end for Olof Palme, because what follows through with this is clearly a series of operation and covert operation that is there to undermine his mandate, to undermine his prime ministry, if you will. And I think the biggest debate at the time in Sweden was the possible involvement and possible influence that the Navy intelligence had by entertaining conversations and discussions with NATO, US and MI6 and CIA with regards to submarine intrusion in submarine waters. And this was just not simply an incident that nobody was aware of. This was something that was programmed, and some of the military high brass in Sweden was basically covering up their involvement and their effort in allowing foreign submarine, and definitely not Soviets, being involved in this particular operation, which was, as I said, a psyop operation to turn the Swedish public against the USSR, against Olof Palme idea of peace, and promote the NATO extension, and to a greater extent basically the NATO agenda in Europe. So it's very important to look at that, because there was 3 commissions that were established to inquiries and commission that was established to investigate this Hårsfjärden event, if you will, in the fall of 1982, when these submarines starting to appear, in the archipelagos of Sweden, in the Swedish territorial waters. And the media played an important role, because after 2 or 3 days, these guys starting to turn up at the Naval Academy, and this massive amount of about more than 500 journalists coming, filming the event, filming these submarines, basically going from one island to the next, coming very close to the palace and so on. So there was a lot of media input in this particular story that made it very possible to turn a Swedish public, which prior to this event and prior to the Whiskey on the Rock was probably around 5-10% in favor or looking at USSR, as a threat. Most of the people never looked at the USSR as a threat to Sweden. And after this particular polemics and this incidents, Whiskey on the Rocks and the Half-Yarden incident, then you had almost 50% of the population, probably even more, that started to feel that the USSR was indeed a threat, and looking at Olof Palme as someone that was not providing the security and the defense response that was expected. So it was a very successful PSYOP in the way. And the first commissions, just to go back to these commissions that investigated this submarine intrusion, the first one basically unanimously, I think, declared that it was a Russian submarine that was responsible for this intrusion and the mayhem and the tantrum in the Swedish waters. The second commission was completely not sure, they were not conclusive about definitely accusing the Russians. So it was not conclusive. And then from what I understand, way later after, there was another investigation, which I believe was the Equus Commission, if I remember well, with Ola Thunanders, one of your colleagues there in Sweden, was participated in, which he basically provided a lot of insight into these investigations. And clearly at that time, there was enough information and plus, of course, various testimonies and interviews conducted with Swedish television at the time, which starting to point out of a US and a British involvements and some kind of a secret agreement between the army, the Swedish army, and NATO / US and UK. And the way they described this and this particular incident was that the British had used porpoise submarines and introduced these submarines into the Swedish waters. In total, there were 6 submarines, so different class submarine, definitely. But some of them actually were fitted. I don't know if you have the pictures, but people can find it online. And you will see the submarine basically fitted with 2 anchors that allows mini submarines, or what people call midget submarines, that can be deployed. The difficulty with this particular submarines and having, of course, too many submarine on top of it is very difficult, because the salinization of the Baltic Sea is very different from the Atlantic or the Northern Sea. So you need to increase your flotations in order to accommodate too many subs. And these mini subs were basically going on the seabed all across the Swedish waters, and they were part of the tantrums, and you could recognize them because of their periscopes. And according to Ola Thunder, that has done the investigation, it would seem that these mini subs had a Italian design, from what I understood from him. And the reason why the Italian design was chosen is simply because the American wanted to have a plausible deniability. So if anything that's going to happen, no one could get back to the US, because they would
just to confirm the time frame we're talking about.
Fall 1982, that's it started, and it went on for several weeks. And then the commissions 1983, and then the second one thereafter on the back of that. And then much later on, I think years 2001, the Equus Commission came out. And it's very interesting to read the documents, listen to the interviews and different testimonies that was provided for these commissions, but especially the last one. The last one is very revealing, because it clearly basically cast the light on this kind of a discrepancy within Sweden, where you have a corp of oligarch and very rich bankers and very rich corporate guys that are not satisfied with Olof Palme. So they entertain this side conversation with NATO, CIA, and MI6, and allow this intrusion under the kind of the disguise of training exercises. So it reminds us a little bit of the Baltops, and the Northern Coast, exercises in the Baltic Sea in 2022, where exercises are used as an excuse to cover another operation, whether it's a psyop, whether it's a covered or semi-covered operation. And that's really was the end for Olof Palme, because that's really turned everything around. And just to go back, if you allow me, to Mats Nilsson, because this book is looks very interesting, and certainly I'm going to put my hand on that. But what I wanted to say, and I wanted to ask Mats, if that's okay for me to ask you questions. But I know you have not finished the book, but what's interesting for me is to understand, if you make the relationship in between the last days, the last few weeks before his assassination. I remember that, if I'm correct, that Olof Palme was due to visit Moscow and the Kremlin to have a meeting with Gorbachev with regards to a very, very important meeting with regard to demilitarization, the abandonment of nuclear, deweaponizations, and so on. And this was probably the highest level meeting that Olof Palme was able to attend in Russia. Do you have any kind of incline on that?
Yes, I most certainly do.
By the way, Mats, if you could just put that book up on screen again and just hold it so people can see the title and the author there. Who's the author of this book?
It's Mr. Gunnar Wall.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good shot. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's available in English or not, but
not yet. But perhaps there will be some publisher who is interested. I can actually reach out to Mr. Wall and ask him if there is anything in the workings to have it translated. Because one of the theories in returning to your question, Freddie, yes, Palme was on the verge of heading over to create this Sea of Peace. An area of de-escalation around the Baltics, which would set a precedence that wasn't loved by anyone in the Western imperial hemisphere. So thereby, the hand was kind of forced for the powers that be that wanted to remove Palme. And if we make a quick connection to 9/11, I think both of you remembered what happened during 9/11. That nothing worked. Nothing worked on 9/11. I mean, the operational areas that were supposed to keep control of the U.S. Airspace, they didn't respond as they should. That you couldn't get the fighters in the air on time, and so forth and so on. The same thing happened the night Olof Palme was killed. Almost nothing within the police communication centers functioned after Olof Palme was murdered on the evening of February, I think February 28th of 86. The mistakes and failures to act according to protocol, they were so numerous and they were so serious that you have to ask yourself, or you should have asked yourself if you were a murder investigator, could this have been sabotaged and delayed on purpose by the people who were tasked to lead this assassination, to facilitate Palme's murderers being able to escape? Because several testimonies and witnesses have indicated that Säpo, that is the Swedish secret police, the Swedish CIA, was already on site at the police command center at an early stage and was considerably more active within the police communication center than they have been willing to admit at a later stage. So it's you have a situation where Palme is going to the Soviet Union to discuss de-escalation. We know that wasn't popular, and we know that people who have been investing in peace have been taken out before. I mean, I remind you of Dag Hammarskjöld, for example, who was also murdered while trying to create peace. So being in the business of peace is dangerous. So given the circumstantial evidence of external involvement and these professional killing crews that could have been in Stockholm at the time, it's reasonable to say that Palme's decision to go to the Soviet Union cost him his life and cost Sweden, dare I say, a very formidable politician.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, because that's the line of investigation that I've of course followed through a little bit without the book. The book will be probably easier, giving the legal background and more details about what really went down that night, because it's a lot of confusions. That's what I recall as well from the telecommunications, and which of course implied to some degree, without assuming, of course, but this is a standard proceeding with intelligence operation, when you shut down something to create a window of opportunity, whether it's to liberate that person or to have him killed by the people you want them to kill. This is also going back to what I really enjoyed about modern criminology. And modern criminology is very important, especially if we are looking into the NordStream sabotage. We need to apply this latest techniques on how to solve crimes, because if you're going to apply the all motives and means and opportunity, you're going to get some of the answer, no doubt. It still works, but if you really want to go down to address this kind of operation, you're going to have to ask and to go a little bit further and to go further. And that's probably the same for Olof Palme's murder, which I believe is politically motivated, of course. But I think what we need to understand is not why, in terms of trying to understand the cui bono or the motives, but it's why it was done the way it was. Why did they did it that way? It's not just why, it's why they did it that way. And when we go back to the Nord Stream pipeline, it's important. Why did they choose to do it at 80, 100 meters almost depth when they could have done it at 23, 25, maybe 30 meters? Much easier, much quicker, much faster, less resources, less time consuming. So why they do it at 80 or 100 meters below?
Hold that thought.
I'm interested.
We'll go to NordStream in a moment to get some final thoughts on that, Freddie. But just to round off the Olof Palme murder, it's just a picture of the crime scene there. You can see the blood on the pavement there. And then when I saw this, what was interesting was just reading the accounts at the time, which, when you look at deep state assassinations, false flags, you see a lot of anomalies at the crime scene. And one of those anomalies, of course, is a spoiled crime scene where people are allowed to traipse through, where the sort of crime scene is not secure. And that's exactly what we learn here. And I'll bring this up on screen so you guys can see. This is from some of the reportage going over this event later. On the night of the killing, the crime scene was not secured, and the members of the public traipsed through the snow to lay flowers, meaning no footprints could be found. So the crime scene was essentially spoiled. One of the bullets fired by the killer, who took a shot at Palme's wife, Lisbeth, but missed and grazed her back, was not found until 2 days later by a passing member of the public. I mean, this is the prime minister of the country. So this is not a serious investigation, like forensically. I mean, how could that be? I mean, this is just beyond like, oh, it's a mishap. Oh, it's a cock up. So it's like either a cover up or it's a cock up. And the mainstream media are always going to say, oh, it was a mistake. Oh, it was a cock up, when they have the inquiry years later. Oh, well, we need more money allocated towards security because we were just underfunded and understaffed. I mean, that's normally how the post analysis goes on this. Guys, I just found this just to be crazy because it parallels a lot of these types of shady events that we see in the present day. So there it is again. You have the lone wolf, you have the spoiled crime scene, you have, and the list goes on and on. It's just almost like a laundry list of, false flags. So, I mean, I was just saying, I'm kind of shocked to have read that in preparing for this conversation, Mats.
Yeah.
So it's really shady. It's
shady. I can just add one final thing to this, and that's the fact that when something like this happens, of course, and I mean, an all-out call should go out quickly. the Prime Minister of Sweden has been shot, you should have made a total lockdown of the Stockholm area, because Stockholm is quite easy to lock down because it's placed on different islands, and there are quite easy boundaries to close. However, Palme was shot at 23:20, somewhere around there. The all-out call that Olof Palme was shot and everyone should be on alert was made 05:24. Wow. That's basically 6 hours after he was shot. And this is just, it has never been it's never been explained why they failed to do this, because even if you have a drunk driver's incident where a drunk driver kills someone and does a hit and run, those calls went out within the hour trying to find that car. But suddenly, when the Prime Minister is killed in Sweden, which up until this day was a very peaceful country, considered a peaceful country, they waited 5+ hours to make the all-out call. And I mean, this was just one of all the discrepancies that happened that night. But it's just another sign that things aren't what they seem to be, as so often before.
Yeah, and there's a photo on screen. That's from March 1st, 1986. Flowers being laid at the site. Of course, a spoiled crime scene, nonetheless. But so this is a fascinating, and I think a very, as both you and Mats, you and Freddie, both have basically pointed this as a serious, major geopolitical event. This assassination, and even though Sweden was a neutral country at the time, the significance of it cannot be underestimated. And it brings us to the present day. And I want to wrap up this conversation. I'll give Freddie the floor for the final couple minutes. But Freddie, you started talking about the NordStream. And I will add this, well, during Whiskey on the Rocks, there was a Soviet major maritime drill going east of Bornholm Island called Zapat 81. Major Soviet military drill. That just adds a little bit of spice to our speculation about what Mats was talking about as well. So there's a lot more work to be done. We're not going to sort of claim that we're going to solve this mystery during this particular podcast, but we can certainly come back to it in article form or in another installment of this. But Freddie, go ahead. I'll give you the final couple minutes. But if you want to put anything else in context, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear Mats as well. I think he has a theory about something that he mentioned at an earlier stage of this conversation. I'd like to hear his thoughts as well. But very quickly, briefly, my take on the NordStream sabotage, and without going into too much details, because this is an investigation that's been conducted for 18 months. So a lot of details, a lot of things that might be useful or that might be really not that useful after all. But what's important, the essentials here in terms of the approach and the mindsets looking at this sabotage is really where it happens. Geographically speaking, you get the Bornholm Island, you get the Bornholm basins, and you have to look at the hydrographic numbers, the data, and you're going to very clearly find out that between the exclusive economic zone of Denmark and Sweden, you get an areas of 80 up to 100 meters. And then the second biggest area for submarine is in the Gdansk basins in the Polish territorial waters. So all this exclusive economic zone, if you will, Poland, Sweden, Denmark and Germany are all linked, and that's already give you a clue as far as the geographical access to the sites. The second thing is, of course, from my point of view, is we're looking at waters that are territorial or not. I mean, exclusive economic zone surface belongs to everyone. This is international waters according to the law. But if you go below the sea, it belongs, and it is under the responsibility of the Danish authorities. And when I was looking into the Nord Stream pipelines and the setting up of this, the laying of this pipeline in the Danish exclusive economic zone, I had to look at the permit. And the permit is very telling, because if you look at the Danish energy agencies, they delivered a permit to Nord Stream 2 Agas. And if you look at section 28 of this particular permit, you will find that the Danish exclusive economic zone is actually a NATO submarine training grounds. And they basically tell in this 28th section of this permit that Nord Stream 2 is not allowed to divulge any information with regards to submarine activities in the Danish exclusive economic zone because of it being a NATO training ground for submarines. So that's kind of a grasped my attention, but I thought I left it on the side until more came. And then later on during this investigation, I've realized that during June 2022, a submarine operation was conducted in the Baltic Sea. And that's really interesting because it is conducted under US command, US 6th Fleet Command, because Strike for NATO falls under the command of the United States. Baltops 22 in June 2022 is a US-led exercise that is produced by NATO under the order of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which at the time was Top Walters. What I was very interesting when I bump into this, the chain of command and the presence of all the military NATO assets during Baltops 2022. Who does what? Who are they? How they link with each other's? What team are they part of? And more importantly, who are the players? And then the highest level of command, because chain of command doesn't lie in military, you will find that there is a submarine operation going on that is basically deconflicted by an agency. And this agency is a German agency. So when the BND is telling us that they're not aware of anything that happened in the waters surrounding the blast site, I'm questioning absolutely what they're saying. I'm actually challenging them because there's clearly the deployment of an agency, which is a deconfliction agency for underwater activities, which means that Germany has agreement under NATO with Denmark as far as the deployment of submarine in the Danish exclusive economic zone. And they are not the only one, but they were responsible because they are the most local partner of NATO to manage this agency and manage the flow of underwater activities in this particular area. It is about avoiding collision. It is about managing the communications between other submarines. And it is also about making sure that Surface Command is understanding what's going on at the bottom and who's there and who's what, So this is all a process and people can learn about it. I'll of course, divulge more information about Submarine Operation Authority. It's a concept that was deployed by the Navy and the US Navy. It's all about underwater telecommunication and then ISR, intelligence surveillance gathering. But now you're putting the dots together. You have a permit telling you that the exact water when this sabotage took place is a NATO submarine training ground. And then I found literally the official documents directly from NATO, not from me, not from anybody else, from NATO. And I've got the knowledge today that submarine operation was conducted during Baltops 2022. And that really reshaped my investigation because I'm like everyone. I'm looking for vessel. I'm looking for skills. I'm looking for opportunities. I'm looking for how does people do that? We need to see explosive. Who had access to explosive during that time? But then also my knowledge with regards to investigating NATO has always pushed me to look at where it's the less evidence, which is basically the surface activities on the Baltic Sea is merely the representation of what is going on at the bottom on the seabed of the Baltic Sea. And it is an underwater demolition. So if we are to spend time looking into and trying to explain the sabotage, we need to look at underwater activities and not surface activities. And underwater activities are very, very important because they're regulated. They fall under very specific doctrines. We talked about targeting strategy, for example, from NATO. Okay, if you can't take a target, even if it's a Russian target, you can't take it out on Danish territorial soil or authorities without an agreement. Within NATO, there is a process. It's called the SCAR process. All right, the STAR process is very important because it outlines the rules of engagement for NATO or the United States or a NATO member to take out an enemy target in a member states and allies. All that is regulated and it's got doctrine and methods attached to it. So everything's becoming more meaty, if you will, when you start to develop this understanding of underwater activities and starting to understand that it is possible, very possible, that the Nord Stream sabotage was actually executed with the help of submarine or a mini sub, which link back to all the UK presence and all the US presence in the Sweden territorial waters in 1982, where for different reasons, of course, for setting up the ground for moving their NATO expansions and getting rid of anyone portrayed as socialist or communist. It doesn't matter, but at the end of the day, at this time, this is really this is something for me that really bogged my mind, that we've only looked into Ukrainian operation. And I think I already told you that, Patrick, but I've had the chance to speak with various experts in diving and explosive ordnance and military special operation in the US as well, not only in Europe. And I can tell you there's a consensus. No one, everyone's telling you, well, there's only few people in the world that can do what was done there. So, and then the rest, of course, I'll tell you more about it. But it's very clear to me that there was two stories, a parallel story to allow the crime to happen. So you get the Ukrainian story, which has been pushed by the media, same as what happened in Sweden, the media pumping a narrative. And then on the other side, it creates a window of opportunities that everybody's focusing on this. That's what you've been sold. That's what you need to believe. And on the other side, there's a complete elephant in the room where clearly, nobody has actually asked NATO, the European Union. No one has asked them about their whereabouts and their activities between May 2022 and September 2022. And there are enough circumstantial evidence, enough real data that can show that definitely something was happening in these waters, and NATO was aware of it, Sweden was aware of it, and Denmark was aware of it. And no disrespect, because France was certainly aware of it, and we were all aware of it, at least in Europe. And I say it always goes down into the state of mind of covert operation and CIA operation and MI6 operation. They're not going to do that just themselves. They need to involve another party in one form or another, whether it's the design of the mini-sub or whether it's actually the people involved. But they're going to want them to be involved because that provides deniability if things goes wrong. And on the other hand, it keeps the people mouth shut. I mean, why Germany hasn't spoken? They have used the media, but the official statement from the German administration has not come out clear and, absolutely abundant with information. They've just basically kept their mouth shut and let the media, the Washington, the Wall Street Journal, all these guys reporting on their behalf. That's not what a government do. Governments, when they have something to say and they investigate, they don't say anything, but when they come out, they come with a complete story, documented proof, and so on and so forth. They haven't done that, and I don't think they will ever do it because they fear one thing: people like us, people that ask questions, and people that investigate and that look deep into what happened and the events that preceded the NordStream sabotage and the events that happened and occurred after the NordStream sabotage, meaning the underwater post-blast forensic, because that's a big subject also to tackle. So we're starting to get a very good idea of what happened. That's what I can tell you for now.
Yeah. Oh, don't look at the data. Don't look at all the NATO forces in the area. We have the Wall Street Journal and we have Deutsche Welt. They've told us it is a drunken evening of Ukrainian Zelensky's crack team of special ops in a 50-foot sailboat. They managed to do it somehow, and a little bit drunk, cigarettes, mopeds on the dock. It was like, I don't need to look at NATO's drills, Freddie. You must be crazy. You must be mad.
That will be the next Netflix series on the Nord Stream bombing. The drunk Ukrainians on the boat.
It'll be epic. It'll be absolutely epic. I can't wait for it. And so, yeah, we're just at the edge of our seats there. So, yes, thank you for that, Freddie. And Matt, your final thoughts on all this?
I'll give a quick few final thoughts. One of the first is that the truth will probably be buried in the Bornholm Deep for another decade or so. But I think the knowns and the unknowns to this is, number one, NATO has not conducted an official investigation into the responsible parties. And the interesting thing is, NATO has not openly blamed Russia either, which means that even NATO knows that they can't make a story that's able to hold enough water or substance to blame Russia. And as for the forensic part, I would just like to steer everyone towards the fact that something I read a few months ago was that Greenpeace wanted to investigate the impact of the explosions in November. However, when they came, there was a big ship over the scene of the attack, and this was the Norwegian ship Northern Frontier. I don't know if you read about this one, Freddie.
Yes, Northern Frontier. Yeah,
Northern Frontier was there, and it was it's a Norwegian ship, and it's actually used to suck up ore from the depths of 3,000 meters off the coast of South America. It's like a giant Hoover or a giant vacuum cleaner. Now it was also rented to the Americans. And what was a giant vacuum cleaner doing over the explosion site of the NordStream? So when Greenpeace approached, it wasn't stopped by Norwegians or Swedes or Danes who had control, or Russians or Germans. It was actually this United States Coast Guard ship that was accompanying the Northern Frontier, the United States Coast Guard ship Hamilton.
That's right.
Who denied access while covering for the Northern Frontier. So when it comes to forensics, this was probably one of the biggest cleanup operations in the word cleanup. that giant vacuum cleaner was there to get rid of any evidence that follow-up Russian investigations might or might not find. So there is obviously once again there have been a lot of questions concerning this, and the answer will be given to us. The question, as always, is, will we three be there to say, I told you so? Or will this be for our children to say, well, you know, my dad actually called this out 20 years ago or 30 years ago? We don't know. The truth will eventually come out. We're probably speaking the truth now, but until it's officially recognized, there has to be a few more years to go, as always.
Yes.
But that's why we're here. We're here to eternally question the current narrative. And hopefully one person or two people might start asking the same questions that we're asking. And that is why we're here, or at least that's why I'm doing this. Trying to motivate other people to ask the questions that we're asking ourselves.
Absolutely. It's look, Mats, it's really the right approach anyway. We're not getting any younger, but we still have this capability to look into details and asking questions. And it's all start by asking questions. It's that fair question. We don't need to go into assumptions or conspiracy, just simply asking fair questions. You know, if there's a crime, who are the victims? We are the victims. Europeans are the victims. Our grandparents are chilling, in their house with electricity bills they simply cannot afford. We have so many people, hundreds of thousands of business across Europe has been impacted by this sabotage. And we are meant to just stay here and not asking questions. Europe is not asking questions. Van der Leyen is not asking questions. Olaf Scholz certainly don't want to answer any questions. And so it comes down to us. And I have to say, being a citizen comes with a responsibility. I've always been a firm defender of that idea of citizenship doesn't come for free. You pay your taxes, you contribute in one way or the other to the economy of your country, but you also have a moral responsibility. And I think that I want to see more of that. So what you're saying is absolutely spot on. It's really about responsibilizing people and tell them, look, don't wait for us to pass away. Start to do the homework, ask questions. And if you can't do it with the internet, go and knock at the doors, maybe at your local governments or central governments, and ask them questions, because that's your fundamental right. Freedom of speech is very important because it allowed us to hold these people accountable. And they can come with all the artificial intelligence in the world they want. They're not going to shut us up. There's going to be a minority that's going to be out there always asking questions. And I'm very, very proud to be part of these people. Last thing, and I will finish on that, Mats, if you allow me, is for those that research out there and like that story of the Nord Stream sabotage. going back to the Norman frontier, which was chartered by Solstad. Solstad has signed a contract with a company called Ocean Infinity. Ocean Infinity is a company that is based in Texas. It's an American company, but has a headquarters in the UK. That company, if you trace them back, or if you pay attention to detail, you will see that this is the same company that was deployed for the search of the Malaysian airline flight in the Pacific. Okay, so that's
MH370.
MH370. I was looking for the number. Thanks, Pat.
Yes.
And so interesting to see how this company had a 3 years contract with Solstad, which from Norway, which chartered this particular vessel to Ocean Infinity. And Ocean Infinity was asked to stop his contract for a period of time because Solstad wanted to send the Norman frontier in India and then further down the line to Australia before bringing back the vessel into the Baltic Sea under the governance of Ocean Infinity. And then everything goes dark. We just simply don't know. Solstad said that they basically negotiated with Ocean Infinity, telling them that, well, we're going to take it back. You don't have to finish the full term of your contract, which was a 3 years period, which would have taken us right into the fall and winter of 2022. So to find out who chartered the Norman frontier is very, very important because, as Matt says, it was a mop-up operation. Mop-up operation that involved definitely DTXG, Defense Threats Exploitation Group from the UK, which is again, this exploitation unit from the US Navy that are specialized in recovering evidence because it can be a reverse engineer or simply because it needs to get rid of it. And then the other one was the local partner. Denmark definitely dove in the Danish exclusive economic zone. There's no way you're going to send divers from the US, from Germany or whatever without having the local partners diving. So the German divers, you guys know for sure what's going on there and what did you find there. Speak up because all of us we've been impacted by that. This has nothing to do with Russia, absolutely zero, nothing to do with Ukraine. It's about big money, and I will prove it to you.
So a lot to digest, a lot to unpack in the future, and I'm sure we'll do our very best in making that happen. I want to thank you guys for joining us for this midweek wire, 21 Wire Live midweek. Freddie Ponton, Matt Nilsson, thank you guys very much. Great conversation. A little bit of history, a little bit of context, and then bringing it forward to the present day. It's what we love doing on our programs. So thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
And ladies and gentlemen, there they go. And I just want to remind people as well that we currently have a winter fundraising drive on at 21st Century Wire. Very important time of the year. This is when we raise the funds for the next 12 months. So if you like what we do, you like this content, you like the sort of analysis that we're delivering to you each week, now twice a week, plus the other content that we're putting out as well via 21stcenturywire.com. Please find it in your hearts and your minds to support us in any way you possibly can here. There's different methods. And of course, you can subscribe monthly for a very, very small amount and become a member at 21wire.tv. And we encourage you to do that. We hope that you can donate and we'll put it to good use. We have a great team. We're trying to build our team out. So we have some part-timers, some volunteers, some different people involved, and we want to keep this going and we want to grow it and we want to go from strength to strength. We need your help. We need your help right now to make that happen. So thank you guys who have supported us. We're going to need your support going forward consistently. So try to maybe take out a monthly membership or drop us a donation in our tip jar there. Just go to 21stcenturywire.com to donate or support button. You can see at the top of my X profile at 21wire. There's a link to this at the top of my X profile as well. But that's all we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. And again, thanks to our amazing guests for an amazing conversation. We went well over time the allotted time that we had for this, but I think it's important. Certainly our guests have a lot to contribute and a lot to say about these really important topics. We'll be bringing you more. Keep an eye at 21stcenturywire.com. The rest of you guys, I'll see you at Sundays for the Sunday Wire. Hopefully we'll have something special lined up for you this week. Take care. All the best. We'll see you very, very soon. Oh, by the way, we also wanted to watch our website over the next couple of days. We're going to have hopefully something interesting in terms of investigative reporting. We'll leave it there, but we've got a few things in the pipeline. So do keep an eye at 21stcenturywire.com. Very close eye on our website going forward. And thank you guys. Thank you for your readership, for your viewership. We'll see you very soon. Take care.